Hello, my name is Twyla Tardif, and I am the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome you today to our 8th presentation in the virtual LRCCS Noon Lecture Series, Winter Term 2021. Today's talk is going to be given by Professor Bryan Miller, and I will introduce him shortly. You will also be able to see our complete schedule on the China Center's website, and we send out emails reminders weekly. So if you're not on our weekly reminder list, please get on it. At the end of today's presentation, we invite you to submit any questions that you might have for our speaker by typing them down at the bottom of your screen into the Q&A box, and I will moderate them and read them to our speaker for you. We begin today's lecture with an announcement. Our next presentation in our noon lecture series will be held next Tuesday, March 16th, and will be given by Wayne Soon, who is Assistant Professor of History at Vassar College and will be speaking on global medicine in Chinese East Asia, 1937 to 1970. And we welcome you to join us for that. So today's presentation will be given by Bryan Miller, who is a lecturer in UM's Department of the History of Art. And Dr. Miller received an MA in archaeology from UCLA and a PhD in East Asian civilizations from the University of Pennsylvania. His research investigates the history and archaeology of early empires in East Asia, focusing on intrapolity social and economic developments that occurred over the course of large polities, as well as the interaction between regimes of Mongolia and of China. His publications include studies of political substrata and the roles of local elites in regional politics. Apologize, that was a momentary translation from my dog. For those dogs at home. His publications focus on alternate models of interaction for frontier matrices of cultures in contact, functions and configurations of urban settings, and the interplay between local politics and larger processes of globalization. He is currently completing a book manuscript. I hope your dogs are appreciating the translation. He is currently completing a book manuscript on the Xiongnu Empire for Oxford University Press. Today, he will be speaking on cultural mediations in the Great Wall frontier, the Southern Xiongnu in northern China. Please please join me in welcoming him. And this concludes our dog-to-dog translation.
Thank you for that introduction. And my apologies, I do not have any dog translation today, so we'll try and proceed as best we can. So today, I have Great Wall Frontier in the title, mainly because it's one of those key phrases that sort of brings you in. But in the vein of many of other scholars who have sort of deconstructed this notion of the Great Wall Frontier being this perfect line between one single entity and another monolithic entity, that's the direction I'd like to proceed today. And a few sort of side narratives in the beginning, but I promise they are related to the talk at hand. One of the things that we have to think about when we talk about cultural interaction, and that's in history and archaeology and other similar disciplines, is the terms we use. Everything from hybridity to diffusion often comes from biology and other disciplines and carries with it all these notions of how different entities, in this case, biological entities, but in the cases we talk about is cultural, social, and political entities, what happens when they interact with each other. And more importantly, what happens at those interfaces. And so the notion here that's usually put forth, especially in relates to the Great Wall frontier or even frontiers of the Roman Empire, the limes or anything else, is this idea of there's the one expanding entity and the other entity that it interacts with, and slowly but surely one sort of envelops the other and the other acquiesces. And so in terms of history and archaeology, what we're usually posed with is this idea of somewhere it's either staunch resistance and conflict, or it's the sort of accommodative acquiescence and acculturation. In terms of the types of investigations that have been done in history and archaeology, we have here, and this is only a few books to mention, but there are a lot of scholars that for a number of years, a number of decades, have been pushing back against this idea of this sort of muted other, the muted indigenous groups, the non-civilized, as some of the old tropes would put forth. So beginning with people like Eric Wolf trying to give history to the cultures and the groups which weren't producing their own documents, all the way up into scholars such as Richard White proposing this idea of the middle ground, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. And even in the realms of archaeology, we have a host of literature, including edited volumes, such as Enduring Conquests, which is coming out of this post-colonial movement to try and give a not so much black and white portrayal of the interactions of indigenous and colonial groups, but to also paint a picture about what's happening in this in-between. And so some of the assumptions about this frontier zone between the steppe and the zone, as some of these early scholars would say, or in this case, between the steppe and the Central Plains, is coming from scholars like Lattimore. But even Lattimore himself has a few caveats in there. And it's these small little admissions that I want to latch onto and move forward from. On one page, he says, between the true steppe environment, and that sort of goes along with the idea that everything up in the steppe was all one culture and everything's the same, but still. Between the true steppe environment and the true Chinese environment, there lay a debatable margin, a frontier determined by a complex balance of cultural, economic, social, and military factors. And it's this sort of muddledness, this debatable and constantly debated situation that I think is really more telling of what was happening in these kinds of frontiers. And so to move into the ideas of what happens when you have in these sort of colonial constructs, ideas of cultural contact and cultural interaction, one of the most famous pieces about this notion of acculturation comes from an old article from the 1950s by Quimby and Spoor. And one of the examples that they have was this idea of an indigenous chief going to Washington, D.C., meeting with officials there, and then coming back to his own group. And in the narrative and the painting that went with this small story, they sort of latched onto it and said, okay, well, what we have here is a normal type of thing. You have everything of the so-called native dress, all the garbs, and as soon as they go to Washington, D.C., he receives all these other things, and this is the process of acculturation. Of taking on all the social norms, the ways of dress, everything else of this American culture. But if we come back to Ketlin's painting and Ketlin's story that he put down in this original book in the 1800s, what we see is a radically different narrative of this idea of these individual agents of cultural interaction in these go-betweens between these larger cultural and social and political entities, of the kind that I think scholars such as Naomi Standing, working with Liao Qitan and other people, would definitely agree with on how we can try and piece together the individual persons and individual communities that sat between these cultural regimes. And in the case of this specific chief, he goes and he gets all these things, and then he comes back to his area. And what he does almost immediately is he takes apart all of the military garb and everything else that he's got. He gives the buttons to some people, he gives the belt buckle to other people, and he pieces off all the individual elements rather than keeping this coat as it was properly supposed to be worn by a male in the military in the American culture. And the one thing he keeps is actually the woman's umbrella. And so this idea that if you have objects from this other culture, or if you interact with this other culture, you by default, in this sort of diffusionist or hybrid model of the less civilized or the barbarian, eventually just acquiesces to this other culture simply by being in contact with it, is not at all what's happening in any sphere, whether it's East Asia or anywhere else. And so what I want to do is come back to this idea, be a biological other, and look at cultural interaction under the microscope, so to speak. And even this, these nice things from the University of California highlights when you start to look underneath, there's so much more happening than just one culture blob against another culture blob. So the case study that I want to talk about today is in the prime focus, the area of the so-called Great Wall region. This is the area where, you know, the Qin dynasty did its first big expansions and road and wall building. And in this area, around 50 BCE, or 50 CE, excuse me, until about 150 or maybe even as far as 200 CE, what we have is this entity called the Southern Xiongnu. And it's called the Southern Xiongnu in the Chinese historical records in order to differentiate it from the actual Xiongnu up here, which the Chinese texts are calling the Northern Xiongnu, even though it's pretty well understood that the Xiongnu themselves probably never call themselves the Northern Xiongnu at all. And so I have sort of a textual blurb and a material cultural blurb right here. The chapter in the Hohanshu that describes this entity of the Southern Xiongnu begins with this little mention of the idea that the Southern Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu is the ruler of the Xiongnu, that the Southern Xiongnu was so deeply into the process of acculturation. He was turning toward Han culture, and that affected everything that, you know, happens in the policies he has and everything that happens for all of his underlings and entourages and his local lords. And the other thing that happens is in this frontier, you start to see little structures over the tombs and everything else have these kinds of roof tiles with these very propagandistic looking messages of the Xiongnu himself has been made to submit by heaven. So we have this idea from both the material culture of the Han-built tombs and cities and everything else, as well as the Han records, that the Southern Xiongnu entity, its ruler, its local lords, completely acquiesced and were just sort of swallowed up by Han society and Han culture. To backtrack just a little bit in order to understand what was happening when the Southern Xiongnu entity emerged and was established in the Ordos area. Before that, around 1st century BCE, after, you know, Hammudi and all his expansions, there was a huge boom in the establishment of all these new colonies and counties up in this area. And this is a rough distribution of the major archaeological sites that can date to that time period. And this is yet another example of some of these eave tiles that were on the structures up in this area about, you know, the 4 barbarians. In other words, all the barbarians in the so-called directions had completely and utterly submitted. But the non-Han or the steppe local populations didn't disappear. This really detailed survey work by Greg and Trisano a number of years ago has shown that even though you have all of this intense establishment of Han colonies and even colonies before that, there is a contemporaneous existence of some of these local steppe groups. So it's not like the Han come in and the steppe groups go away. And by the time we get to the Eastern Han, and it's soon after the establishment of the Eastern Han dynasty that we have this Xiongnu having some conflicts up in Mongolia. He comes down to the Ordos, he submits to the Han emperor, and they say, okay, you can stay in this Ordos area. But there's a problem going back and forth, this idea of the Xiongnu who comes down knows that there was a precedent 100 years before when his, whatever great-great-grandfather came down and acquiesced and eventually was able to go back up into the steppes and take over the whole Xiongnu Empire. And that's his agenda. At the same time, all of the Han Chinese down in the Central Plains know about that precedent, and they start to put in different ideas of, well, we have to try and make sure that doesn't happen again. We have to do things to make sure he stays down here, that we really bring him into the system so he can't get away, so to speak, and he becomes a buffer state, a puppet for us against that northern entity. So these are the kinds of tensions that are happening at this point. The other thing that's happening is because of the civil war in the Han Empire and all these other dynamics that are happening, a lot of the colonies that have been established under Hammudi and were built up afterwards begin to withdraw. And so not only can you see a drastic drop in the number of sites of Han establishments of cemeteries and walled sites during this later era when the Southern Xiongnu were established, but even from the texts themselves, albeit these censuses have their own problems, but relatively speaking, there's a huge drop in the number of registered households and peoples in all these frontier communities, except for two major ones here. And this one, sorry, three major ones, and those are right here. But in the sort of steppe areas of Ordos, in the regions which had been at different times controlled by Xiongnu entities, we see a huge drop in population, especially this one commandery here. And the idea is that in this little commandery or extra colony area, the Han had invested tons of new populations. And there's a massive drop in there. And so we want to keep our eye on what was happening here to what happened when you had so many of the people here, and yet by the time you get to the later Han, the Eastern Han, and the time of the Southern Xiongnu establishing themselves in this area, why is there a sudden drop here? And part of it can be related to when we look at any archaeological sites, and this is mostly burial grounds, that look very like Xiongnu-esque, they're right in this area. And for what we know of the historical records, we know that the Southern Xiongnu eventually, after shifting around a bit, sort of settled in right in here at a place called Meiji. And this was his camp, his entourage, and everything was right in here. And so it's no surprise that this becomes sort of empty of big Han establishments and becomes the little center. But as you can see from the notion of archaeological sites, and even some of these formal Han colonies, which are still around, they're just massively depopulated, he's still somewhat surrounded. And that was the goal of the Han government at that time. When we look at one of the sites, if we start to wonder, well, who was here, and to what degree were the leaders acculturated and just take on everything that's Han? Have they become Sinicized, so to speak? One of the tombs that is at a site with not a whole lot of graves, and had been actually occupied by groups even before the Xiongnu Empire ever emerged, is the site of Shigopan. And at Shigopan, there's one grave, a normal pit grave with some livestock offerings, but all the adornments of the woman in the grave are very typical steppe elite or Xiongnu elite style, and not just of any Xiongnu elite. These are examples of these little tiny gilded bronze horses, which would have been sewn onto their clothing. And these types of things are found exactly like that in the steppe, but only in the tombs of the highest level elites in the Xiongnu Empire. So not your local leaders, only the ones in these big square tombs that could be called so-called royal. And the same thing happens here. Some of these carpets that are found in the royal tombs in the heartland of the Xiongnu Empire, the same kind of stag that you see here being attacked by the griffin is the same kind of stag that you see here on the gold. But part of the adornments of this woman, of this female elite, are also a host of Chinese jades. And it's some of these jades that have actually been used to shift the relative dating from what we thought this grave was, being sort of early Han or early Xiongnu, and is actually from the far later times, which then shifts it to be a grave of the Southern Xiongnu era, which is very, very important because all the other things that we see in the fact that she has livestock offerings, this normal like big belt plates, everything else, the quadrifoil, gold quadrifoil decorations, which are the same on the coffins of the uppermost elite in the Xiongnu Empire, seem to say that everything, the way she's dressed, is very Xiongnu steppe elite, not just any elite, but Xiongnu royalty style. The other thing, if we want to look at some historical records, and this is texts that aren't just the inherited documents that sat in the capital, these sort of court histories, but if we look at actual writings from the time period down within the Ordos, these seals are actually a nice piece of information. And so the basic form of these bronze seals are the same kind that you had throughout the Han Empire. Although in this case, the ones that were given by, made by the Han elites and then given to the Xiongnu elites, or the elites of the Southern Xiongnu entity, had a camel on top of it instead of anything else. And that's the first sort of distinction that we can see between these special seals that are given to these steppe groups and steppe peoples. The other thing, it has this sort of, and all of these would have had the same language on the front, that it's a Xiongnu individual of the Han realm. That's the idea. But after this sort of precursor here, you then have a series of proper names, which are, it's a personal name or a clan name, we're not totally sure, but you have this proper name here, followed by the name of Juchu or anything else, Rju, Wenyudi. These are all actual titles of lower level ranks within the Xiongnu political system. So they are allowed to keep their own personal names. They're not forced into some, adopting a new Chinese name, which had happened in some of the earlier eras. They also get to keep their Xiongnu titles. So even though they're being given these seals in order to interact with all the Han officials that are in this frontier area, they are never brought into the Han system, political system, social system, and certainly probably not very much the cultural system of the Han that are surrounding them. So it brings us back to this discussion of to what degree were the members of this break-off entity called the Southern Xiongnu, to what degree were they actually Sinicized? Were they brought in to the cultural sphere and the political system of the Han? And to what degree were they connected to or trying to directly reflect and imitate what was going on in the steppe? Because we, with 2020 hindsight, we know that eventually this entity never got out of the Ordos, but not for lack of trying. There are plenty of instances where they tried to break away and rebelled against the Han. They tried to sort of find weak points when things were going a little chaotic in the steppe and make alliances here and come back in, but they just never got out of here. So the first thing I want to do is then look at what were graves beyond just the big royal ones. What were the normal Xiongnu style local elite graves like in the steppe? And for this, I went as far away as I could from the frontier zone, just to grab one example up here in Buryatia. And the main thing that we have to think about is there are these shaft pits. And at the bottom of the pit, you have some sort of coffin, either a wood coffin or a stone containment of some sort. The pottery, which is very distinctive, you have these wide mouth cooking pots, or sometimes these tight mouth, broad shouldered storage jars. The decoration on them is pretty ubiquitous, of this little wave line up near the neck or the shoulder. You have some foreign goods like Chinese mirrors, but they're always broken rather than being whole, as they would most of the time within Han elite tombs. And you have, of course, riding equipment. You have bow and arrow equipment. You have different types of belt clasps and buckles. But the most telling, especially when we get to the example of the frontier, is this idea that you have animal offerings or livestock offerings. But I want to try and qualify that, and I'll show you why in a little while. It's very important not just to say, oh, there's livestock in the grave, therefore it's Xiongnu, and that's the end of the story. What it really is it's offerings of 4 categories of livestock: sheep, goat, cattle, or horse. They're not putting anything else in. Even though in art and text we know that they had that yaks and camels were very significant animals within their society, we don't see them being offered. So there's something about very specific ritual practices related to the offering of certain types of animals. The other thing we see within Xiongnu context is that when these animals are offered, they are never offered, except for the case of dogs, which are very rare. They're never offered as the whole animal. It's either the extremities, usually the heads and the hooves, placed sort of above here. So you have the deceased here, either above it or just to the north of the coffin. Or sometimes in the case of stuck into these cooking pots, you have some body portions like vertebrae or ribs or other things like that. And so when we look at one other site within this Ordo Southern Xiongnu realm, the case of Budongkou, we see the same types of things happening. We see that they have the, heads and hooves of livestock. We see that their bodies are stretched this way. We see the waveline cook pots. We see a normal steppe style cauldron. We see a broken Chinese mirror. These are the normal storage pots. The arrows are normal iron arrowheads as opposed to these little heads for crossbow bolts, which would be normal for a Han tomb. But they do have some Han things that are in there. And this is a very normal Han style ding cauldron, as opposed to the steppe style cauldron, or what Chinese archaeologists would call a fu cauldron. But this brings up the idea that now that you're in the frontier, you have these kinds of significant things like a Han style cauldron being offered to the deceased. But the question is, who is offering that? Is this something that they owned because of their interactions with other Han agents while they were residing within this frontier zone, or is it something given at the funeral occasion? Now, when we flip around the other way and just sort of take a quick look at what was the normal Han style tomb by the Eastern Han, you have the ramp going down, and usually have multi-chambered tombs, these brick tombs. The really low levels might have one chamber, but they almost always have two persons. And the more chambers you have, actually the more people you have, which is not a normal thing in the Xiongnu. Even the huge royal tombs with these big chambers are only for one individual. Any additional people are stuck on these little burials sort of flanking the main tomb, but there's never a lot of people within one single tomb set. Whereas in Han China, that definitely does happen. You have a whole sets of pottery, whereas in the Xiongnu cases, you're usually only putting in cooking pots or cauldrons and storage jars. Very rarely will you find ceramic cups or any like normal feasting vessels. The cauldrons are different. You have this category of Mingqi wares, these sort of models of wells and pavilions and all these other things. The belt pieces are belt hooks of a certain kind rather than these belt clasps. So you can go through the whole range of goods that are in these graves and talk about the types of feasting wares, the types of personal items, and the types of offerings. In this case, usually pig and chicken are the offerings. And so you start to see in all these different variables, you have radically different cultures and practices and traditions. If we start to look at some of the case studies, and this is the cemetery at the cemetery of Zhaoan, here we see an example of these really lovely multi-chambered tombs, brick chambered tombs, and in it all the ceramics and everything else seems to say normal Han offerings. The form of the tomb is a very Han style tomb. And yet some of the animal offerings in here, especially these, which are all various livestock, immediately had the reaction by archaeologists and scholars studying it to say, there's animal offerings in there. It's not pig or chicken. It must be Xiongnu. But I want to highlight this because it's fox. And in Xiongnu traditions, even though we know they were hunting for fur, hunting for food, everything else. It was a normal way of life. They never offered these wild animals as part of their funerary rituals. So that's the first key, that something different from both the Xiongnu traditions and different from the Han traditions is happening at this particular tomb. When we look at another one right nearby Zhaoan, the site of Zhanglonggedan, we see the same kind of thing. Here we see a huge Han-style multi-chambered brick tomb. There's plenty of these Mingqi vessels, little figurines, normal style Han Dynasty vessels, more of these Mingqi things. And then here in one of the side chambers is a normal Xiongnu style with the little waveline cook pot. In the corners up at the front, in these like front chambers, we see offerings of portions of sheep and the heads and hooves of horse and cattle all the way at the back. So you have some presence, at least, of one Xiongnu style pot amidst a whole array of otherwise Han goods. And you also see the presence of very Xiongnu style offerings of specific animals of specific portions. And so one of the things I tried to do was go to a few of the sites that we have very good excavation reporting data from, just as sort of a test run to see if we had this idea of a spectrum of totally Han versus totally Xiongnu. When we look at the structure of the grave, the personal items, the animal offerings, the vessels and the wares and everything that are in there, we get, generally speaking, about 5 different clusters of stuff. And what we might expect from this division of, oh, these are totally Xiongnu sites, these are totally Chinese sites, what we see is there's actually a significant overlap. Oops, too far, too fast. What we see is an overlap. So some of the sites that I put as blue as so-called Xiongnu sites, there are some of them that would cluster more in what you would call a normal Han-style grave, and vice versa. When I take that set of clusters from the analyses and flip it the other way around and say, okay, at each site, how many different things do you have? And if we take the gray as being the truly Xiongnu style set of goods and practices, and we take the darkest of the green as being the truly Han style sets of practices, what we see is at each site, even though there's a tendency between the labeled as Han sites and the labeled as Xiongnu sites towards one or the other, there still is an overlap. And so at each site, even down to one single place, you might say, oh, if there's different practices, maybe at one particular site, the site of Dabaodang, which has really great data, you might think, well, maybe the buried like a Xiongnu person people are in one part of the cemetery, whereas the buried in a truly Han style way are in another sort of part of the cemetery, that we would separate them. And this seems like a normal idea, because even in the case of the armies, the frontier armies of the Han Empire, many times what you would have is you'd have these, what they call the Hu, which was talking about Xiongnu constituents. You'd have these Hu divisions, and those Hu cavalry were always separate. They were treated separately. They were given provisions separately from the truly Han divisions. But what we see at these elite cemeteries is a total mixture in what's happening in each individual tomb, where the tombs are placed. And so what I want to highlight is that these tombs, and most of the data that we have that we're playing with, are actual tombs. But the tombs, as well as these walled towns, these cities that are established by the colonies, are arenas of elite interaction. And so we have to imagine that there are members of the Han political system, just as there are members of the Southern Xiongnu political system, and perhaps even members of the northern or the normal Xiongnu Empire political system convening at these nodes in the frontier. And this is actually a picture of one of the entrances to the tombs at Dabaodang. And so when we talk about the Han cities, they are definitely mostly Chinese occupants, but there are what I would say steppe participants. At a lot of these walled sites, we see of the debris that's at these places, even though the architecture and the weaponry, everything seems totally normally Han. There are remnants of these little bone brushes, bone belt pieces, to show that some of the garbage left behind by normal Xiongnu participants are coming in and out of these cities. And I think the same thing was probably happening at these burial grounds, these cemeteries that we label as Han. You could have the deceased within these tombs could be Han Chinese persons with steppe participants coming and giving offerings. Now, maybe that's why you have these very normal steppe style offerings in an otherwise completely Han Chinese tomb. But the reverse could also be happening, which is what a lot of people have been sort of arguing, trying to identify, because they want to find the Southern Xiongnu. And so they look at these Han style tombs and say, well, they must be steppe occupants with Chinese participants coming and giving all the Chinese style vessels, so that when the person died, even though they may have been a significant person within the Southern Xiongnu system, that they are nonetheless being buried by Han constituents and thus dressed in a very, very Han way. But the same could be said of some of these so-called Xiongnu cemeteries. So when we come back to this one case study, we have to look at, what are the offerings here, which could be, participants coming back in and giving in venerations to the deceased. But the fact that you've got heads and hooves all the way back here where the main person would be is a totally different thing. So talking about these offerings versus these offerings, not only where they're placed, what they are, what portions, what species, is an important dialogue to have. And so I want to come back and take the nice data set of Tabatang again and look at where are these things placed. And the idea in the case of the Xiongnu, when you have these extremities of the heads and hooves of these livestock animals, they're usually placed, just above the coffin or just sort of the north of the deceased. And that idea is you're not putting it right on top of the deceased or right in the containment of the deceased. And I think that notion, when you're faced with a burial structure that isn't normally what you would have in a Xiongnu burial structure, you find another way of having this right at the edge or the extremity. And so that may be why you find them at the fronts of the doors or in the front chambers rather than the rear chambers, these offerings. But in this case, you have herd animals, sheep, goat, cattle, horses. You actually do have whole dogs every once in a while, but you also have wild animals rather than just domestic herd animals, badgers, rabbits, other things like that. You have the portions rather than the whole thing offered. And somebody once asked me, well, are you sure it's not, vermin getting down into the tomb? Like, well, yeah, if it's just the head and the hoof, that's a weird thing to happen. So you have almost like the wrong animal, even with the right placement and portions being given. And then you have the opposite happening, where it's the correct animal, according to Xiongnu traditions, correct placement just to the north, whatever, but now it's the whole sheep, rather than just the heads and the hooves or some other vertebrae and ribs put in a cook pot. So these slight alterations that are neither perfectly Han traditions and definitely also not perfectly Xiongnu traditions, I think if we come back to a lot of the literature about how individual groups or communities or individual persons are trying to navigate their existence between these social and cultural regimes, you often have these sort of misunderstandings. And I think that's when we can reflect on work such as by Richard White and others about this idea of a middle ground. And the reminder is a middle ground is not a place. White and others have had to sort of come back and explain themselves. This is not a space. This is a social space, so to speak, that you have these compromises. And so when you have this interaction, this overlap of all these different constituents, it's very easy to imagine that you could have a person of the Han system dying, and then all these Southern Xiongnu constituents have to come and give offerings, and they give offerings in a different way. They're allowed to do that because they have such great autonomy. And so when we think about the distribution of these Han, so-called Han sites, be they cemeteries or cities, I like this tomb painting of a tomb from that region because it reiterates this idea of this tiny little enclosed city, and you've got a Han elite in their little Han-style chariot, but they're surrounded by a pastoral landscape. It had always been occupied by pastoralists. And even though these Han colonies went into these regions, tried to establish new farming lands, they were still and always surrounded by a pastoral landscape, which is, again, another reason why I think I like that survey that was done by Greg Intrasano and others, because it reminds us, even though you have this massive Han colony right there, just up into the hills, the local pastoral groups continue to exist. And so in this regard, we can look at, I think, material culture as this sort of like hybrid material culture of a Xiongnu title, a Xiongnu name, but with a Han style seal. We can see the adornments of somebody who's clearly very high up in the ranks of the Southern Xiongnu system, having all the normal things that would be for a royal person up in the steppe empire, but with these weird Chinese jade adornments. But it's not just these objects that I think are an important thing to look at for hybridity and cultural interaction in this sort of cultural third space. We can also look at practices. And I think that's why it's important to look at what's happening with animal offerings, because it's a very telling thing about how these local elites were sort of navigating both realms. To sort of end a talk with a rainbow, of happiness. I put this here because of the recent things that are happening in Inner Mongolia. This idea of you're somewhere in between both, and how do you navigate your presence between these different political entities. I have a host of individual people to thank, but here I just put a long list of institutions who have helped me with funding and other things. The paper I present today has been published, but it's through a long, long process. Most of it was researched while I was a Humboldt Stipendiat Fellow at the University of Bonn, so I have to acknowledge the University of Bonn and their lovely Bonn Contributions to Asian Archaeology series, in which this paper has been published. And if you want to know more about all the other frontiers of the Xiongnu, I promise I will go into great depth into them in my upcoming book. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bryan, for that wonderful talk. So we have some time for questions and answers. If somebody would like to put a question into the Q&A box, I would be very happy to read it to Bryan and to moderate the session. Just give people a moment here. So Bryan, I have a question for you actually for, there's one that's coming up here, but I'm really curious as well about how you got interested in the Xiongnu and how you learned about them initially.
It came through China. My master's degree when I was studying under Lothar von Falkenhausen at UCLA was on the iron industry of the Han, and why. And so what I was looking at is how production changes when the government takes control over a production system, and sort of before, during, and after. But in looking into why the government was taking over a production system of a non-prestige good, because most ideas about when polities take over production systems, it's always taking over prestige goods systems, was because the coffers were empty. They were at constant war with the Xiongnu, and they knew that iron and salt and other such industries were very profitable, so they created a monopoly over them, which then made me look at the Yintielun, the debates on salt and iron, to look for issues there. But in the process of looking at that, I kept seeing that there are actually descriptions about the Xiongnu way of life and what they were doing, which are even better than the famous Shiji passages. And so that really got me interested in, because what I was looking at with the Qin and Han case was, how does an empire form when there is no predecessor empire? What about these initial empires? So it was an interest in empires in general. And what I was faced with the Xiongnu was this case study of, it is a primarily pastoral rather than primarily agricultural society. They don't have a formal writing system. They don't have any of the check marks that you would think of when you think of proper empire. And in fact, the Oxford World History of Empires that just came out, this big 2-volume set, it has every single empire, even down to the Kushans of Central Asia, of that axial age of the Romans, the Parthians, every single empire is there, but they're missing one still, the Xiongnu. And so the Xiongnu, even though they are definitely an empire, if we call an empire ABC, it is an empire in the way it functioned, in the way it managed and governed. And yet it's not part of the dialogue because it doesn't tick all those normal boxes that we assume. And so I think the Xiongnu really intrigued me because it was a way to sort of poke a hole in a lot of the models that we have around about how empires work and how political economies form.
Wow, thank you. That tells so much about your intellectual process and a wonderful, real set of questions. We now have some questions from the audience. Sean Kennedy and David Rolston actually are asking almost the identical question, which is, are there Xiongnu descendants alive today? Or extant ethnic groups who see the Xiongnu as their ancestors?
I was actually asked a very similar question. That there's a podcast that should come out sometime this year. And one of the first questions he asked me for this podcast was about that issue of ancestry and are the Huns related to the Xiongnu, everything else. And I think in the case of the Huns and the case of the modern populations, that there is a strong political and cultural ancestry, undoubted. Um, that they constantly go back to that model of what the Xiongnu did, because what the Xiongnu did was so phenomenal and unprecedented, um, of actually creating a primarily pastoral-based empire. Um, but that said, we know from genetics not only that the Xiongnu local elite populations were radically different from the Mongol elite populations. The other thing, and this is a paper that just came out in Cell Journal the end of last year, I think it was, a huge data set with myself and a bunch of other people from the Max Planck Institute that had a really great data set of Xiongnu individuals. And what we see is a tendency in the pre-Xiongnu eras of regionalizations of the East Mongolia is very different from West Mongolia, and there are some like intermixings, whatever. But when you look at the broad PCA plot of populations from the Black Sea all the way to Japan, you see each culture and time period sort of lumps here, here, here. You get to the Xiongnu time period, and suddenly individuals from all over what is now Mongolia are spread all the way across the PCA plot. So something happens when the Xiongnu Empire emerges. And when I then looked back at all the written evidence that I had been doing for my book and the archaeological stuff, and then sat down and had a dialogue with the geneticists and other archaeologists, we finally came to the conclusion of this shouldn't be a surprise. This is what empires do. They conquest, they go into an area, they kill off the local leadership, or they force the local leadership to move to another end of the empire. They create an opportunity. And we know that even at the frontier, these Han colonies, convicts who were forced to serve at the frontier were fleeing up into the Xiongnu for a better life. And so it shouldn't be surprising that there's suddenly this huge diversity at the point of the Xiongnu Empire.
Fascinating. I think you've alluded to the next question from Kuning Lee, who she says is a layman's question, but I think it's a kind of extends what you were just talking about. And she says, so you've got the Xiongnu and then you've got the Huns. Mm-hmm. And she also asks if Hungarians are also related to that.
I think there's enough, again, I think it's a strong cultural heritage for sure, but not biological. There's even a question, the same kind of question actually, about the Turks that rose up out of the Altai Mountains, took over Mongolia, took over Kazakhstan, made the Turkic Empire of the 6th century and so on. Are they related to the modern people of Turkey? And the biological and all the other research has shown no. But there is a strong cultural tie to that. I think one of the most brilliant sort of retorts against this like Han Xiongnu question actually came from historian Chris Atwood, who said, okay, well, if we're going to only use textual data and not use archaeological data, my colleague Ursula Broserder has done a fantastic job of saying, from the archaeological data, we see, no, Huns and Xiongnu are not the same thing. But I think what Chris did was nice, because he looked and said, well, if it's Xiongnu, Han, Hun, if it's the same name, then we trace the name and it's the same people. What he saw is the name, the movement of the name went down into South Asia and back up, and it didn't match the movement of what we understand. And he came back and sort of reiterated that actually Xiongnu, or Hun, or whatever you want to call it, Xiongnu, is a dynasty name, not a name of a people in a group. And so when scholars like Inogile went to look at the frontier documents, these little bamboo slips that are coming out of these colonies, when they're talking about those people up north, they almost never say Xiongnu. They only say Xiongnu when they're writing to the people in the Han capital. Otherwise, they call them Hu, or which is like general word for northerner, or they call them enemy or something else. So it's a reminder that the name of a dynasty can move. I mean, we know the classic example of the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman. So.
Great. Okay, so here's another question about Xiongnu communities in Qinghai and Hexi corridors. Do you know what the relationship is with them and the ones that you discuss in your talk?
That's a really fun conundrum, actually. In looking at the historical records, we can see that there were tons of constituents that were tied to the Xiongnu Empire, all in Hexi or Gansu corridor. You know, a lot of these campaigns, it's interesting because when the Han sent these armies to invade different portions of the Xiongnu Empire, the process of that invasion and defeating it sort of peels back the layer of who's in the box. And what we saw was really important high-ranking Xiongnu people, you know, the daughter of the Chanyu or somebody else, is sitting there in Hexi and Gansu. So they were going in and out and visiting. And sometimes if the Han armies came in, they'd get caught like, I'm not back at home. I got to get home. They're caught. So we know that there was a tight relationship with them. But the bizarre thing is that when we look at the archaeology, we see nothing, no evidence of any cemeteries, of any objects that would say there's a Xiongnu constituency here. But the same thing is happening when we look at Xinjiang. We know that the Xiongnu, before the Han even got out there, the Xiongnu had established this enclave in the Yanqi Basin, which is just a little bit west of Turpan Basin. That there was a person with an actual title, and we know that he was collecting taxes, all these other things, but there's no cemetery that would really speak for like an established community there. So this is, I think, it sort of reiterates the importance of having both a very detailed knowledge of the material record and a very detailed knowledge of the historical record. Because you can see, which is why, even though I've got these culture blobs on my map, like here's Han, here's not the Han, that empires, I think, are better mapped as a series of dots rather than a series of blobs. That the Xiongnu, as any empire, like these islands of empires or disembedded enclaves, other things like that, were reaching out. So the Hexi and the Gansu corridor, as contested as it was, I would love to see a cemetery or even a Xiongnu-style belt plaque coming out of there, but we don't. It's strangely archaeologically silent.
Interesting. So more of an archaeology question from Joyce Marcus, who says, how does the opening and reopening of some tombs in antiquity affect the total inventory of burial goods? Is the tomb a snapshot in time rather than a palimpsest?
Unfortunately, they've been heavily looted. I wish we had better data, which is partially why I turned toward the data of tomb structure and animal offerings. Anybody looting the tomb isn't going to bother with a pile of bones. But that brings up a radical difference between Xiongnu traditions and Han traditions. The tradition, the Xiongnu, was multi-chambers. They were opening again. They had actual doors. They would go back again and again and again, which is why I think there might be some function to those front rooms where you could come back again, somebody else dies, you put them in the back room, you give another offering. But the case of the Xiongnu, that's not what they did at all. One person goes in, maybe one person and a second person, although that's very rare. But when that's done, that tomb is closed. In order to come back and get more and more offerings, what we do see is the development of these little tiny sets of stones that are just to the north of the tomb on some occasions. And in there, we find highly fragmented, burnt livestock bones. So if they wanted to come back and venerate the person later, they would come back to this set of stone pairs to the north. They would do some sort of ceremony, maybe eat the animal, I don't know, and then crush it up and just put the remains right there. But they never reopened the tomb the way the Han Chinese were doing. So that's another, I think, really strange custom it must have seemed to any Xiongnu constituent living in the frontier, that they would go back into the tomb again and again and bury a bunch of people there. I'm not sure, Joyce, if that answers your question.
Right. So here's a question from Xiaolong Wu. And the question is, has research been done in this region based on DNA? You mentioned the DNA research, but to determine the ethnicity of the occupants in addition to the goods or tomb structure. And I think you might have told us the answer that there's very little there in terms of.
Yeah, very little human remains left. Even if there were, the genetics article I just mentioned utilized data that's been published from Chinese studies of Han Xiongnu era stuff. But no, the sample was all from Mongolia. So no, I would love to know, very much love to know. And I do know that the Shigopan grave, which was relatively unlooted, clearly it's got all that gold. If there are any human remains from there, that would be a grave to study. That would be a grave to ask the question, okay, this person clearly doesn't have normal, like local elite Xiongnu stuff. They have the kinds of things that only the royal Xiongnu way up in the steppe would ever have been able to have. Is that person related to any other individuals up north? Are they related to local elites? Are they related to the royal group up in there? That's a huge question to ask as well.
Right. Okay, so one last question, and it's a great one to end on. So can you talk more about, and this is from Yan Shuozhang, can you talk more about the textual relationship between the Xiongnu and Han or Sinic writing? So for an example, Cai Wenji of the Eastern Han wrote about her lamentable forced journeys into the Southern Xiongnu as a Han woman. There's the story of Mulan, or the Ballad of Mulan, who also has references to the Kehan. And then did the Xiongnu then have a textual or literary tradition that elaborated their relationship to the Han?
Unfortunately, they are, as Eric Wolf would say, some of those people without history. But I think the later you go, especially in the post, when we're talking Nanbai Cha era, you get a better understanding of what was happening, a little bit of retrospect. And so during that time period, some of these, collections of poems and odes and stuff, there's actually one ode that got collected about now we're back to the Hushi Quarter, lamenting, supposedly based on a Xiongnu poem of, oh, woe is me, we've lost these mountains, this corridor. The mountains were so great because they had green pastures, and any of the dairy that came from the animals grazing those pastures was like the best butter in the world that you can imagine. So they had clearly their own songs, their own poems, all these things that were happening, but it was heavily an oral tradition. We have no understanding or no inclination that there ever was a formal writing system. And by that, I mean a set of squiggles used to represent actual sentences and thoughts. But what we do have is the very beginnings of sets of markings that were used in a very systematic fashion, what people have called the tamga. And these are stamped on the bottoms of pots. These are etched onto Han lacquer bowls that get imported. They're there. There was a system of accounting that existed, I think, but no formal writing. The one, the beauty, you mentioned a few others, the one that I immediately go to is Wang Zhaojun, who we know almost nothing from the time period of the Xiongnu and the Han. We know that she was a secondary bride given to Huan Yichanyu, but beyond that, we know barely anything except for, her sons and daughters had high ranks in the Xiongnu system. But after that point, suddenly we have all these narratives of she's the bride who pacified the barbarians, and then sometime in the Tang or before the Tang, now she's got a tomb in the Ordos. Is it her real tomb? We don't know, but there it is, it's built, and now everybody goes to visit the tomb of Wang Zhaojun. There's something happened, I think, in the legacy of the Xiongnu into later politics and culture that is really important. If we're talking about East Asia, as well as Central Asia and everything else. So, the elementary.
I guess that's the 1 o'clock siren. Well, thank you so much. And we are at time, as the siren has told us, and really appreciate your talk and bringing us this fascinating work. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining.